we had a conference called a radical consultation in Vermont in 2004, just after the second illegal election of that president. And it was a gathering of some 50, 60 people who said, everything is really a mess, and what is it that we can possibly do? What can right-thinking people do? Let's discuss this. So we began in the morning by saying, well, how about electing better Democrats? It took about 5 minutes before we realized how asinine that was. Discard that. Everyone there fully realized that sending people into the swamp of Washington, D.C., and therefore into the maw of corporate and financial America made no sense at all. Whoever you sent there would have to be prisoner of that same system and would have to engage in the creation and strengthening of the American empire. So that was obviously ridiculous. Then somebody tossed out the idea of a third party, and it didn't take long to discard that. Third parties have always been a failure. The system is rigged against them, of course, but when they get into the system, they are forced to do the same corrupt things that the other two parties do. And they're forced to take their handouts from the corporate interests that they will then be expected to serve. So we reject that idea. There is no point in trying to reform that which is inherently corrupt and inept. So you discard that idea. What's left? How do we make change in the world? Well, somebody from New York City was talking about revolution. What's wrong with a revolution? We had one to start this nation, after all, and we can do it again. And we can develop enough popular support so that even if our firearms aren't as great as theirs are, still we can march on the City Hall and the State House on Washington and take power back. The flaws of that, of course, are multiple, but we did talk about that for a little bit. And then I had to argue that the trouble with the revolution is trying to take over the same evil set of arrangements and systems and institutions that are oppressing you now. And what you do is you take over them and put your own people in there oppressing people. The institutions are what's wrong. And taking them over will not achieve your ends. Robert Frost at one point said that what people really wanted was half a revolution, because a revolution brings the same thing back again. And so at that point I said, well, you know, that wasn't a revolutionary war that this nation began with. That was a war of secession. They didn't want to take over Great Britain. They didn't want to run things from London. They wanted to run things here on their own. That's a war of secession. And the Declaration of Independence is a clear document of secession. When any government is oppressive, it is the right of people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, such as will meet their ends. And at that point, this gathering began talking about secession. And we ended the day by saying that that is the only way that a right-thinking person can act in the given world that we have. As far-fetched as it might seem, that is the only practical way for a political being to act in any sensible way. And it might not be successful, but it's better to try that. And it has a chance of being doable in a way that a lot of other systems don't. It is accepting the given political institution of the state and trying to take that over peaceably and democratically so as to bend it to the idea of secession. And then ultimately to have that state secede from the empire and show the people around the country that it can be done and you can do it. That was the idea that energized us at that meeting. And we came out with a statement which said that it is time to start thinking about separation and secession. That has been the political driving force of the world, at least since 1945, when the United Nations, although it was a multinational organization, it was made up of 51 nations. And today, it's made up of 193 nations, most of which have come about through some form of separation and secession. Most recently, of course, the 15 republics of the former Soviet Union, the republics of former Yugoslavia. And the world can see that it is possible to have successful seceding states without a violent overthrow. And it makes a lot of sense, because each state then can do what it wants to do. And instead of trying to have one size fit all when you have many millions of people, you separate and have different nations created to satisfy the interests and the needs of their own particular population. And if that was good enough for the world in this last 60 years, it should be good enough for us. So let's start talking about secession. And in these succeeding 6 years, indeed, more and more people have been talking about secession. Vermont, in particular, has been quite successful. So successful that last year, in January of this year, they led off with a campaign to elect independent candidates, the independents of Vermont, that is to say, for governor, lieutenant governor, and 7 Senate seats in Vermont. Vermont is interesting in that it does it is a bioregion. And they don't think of themselves that way. That word, that term has not caught on there. But they do think of themselves as different from the Yorkers on the other side of Lake Champlain, and different from their New Hampshires on the other side of the Connecticut River. And in the center are the Green Mountains that gave the state its name. And Vermonters actually think of themselves as a cultural entity, Holstein cows, different from their neighbors. And that's one of the reasons that the secession movement there has been as successful as it has. It's obviously too early to say whether the independent candidates are going to go anyplace, and nobody expects them to win this first time out. But what's interesting is that the candidates have been accepted by the powers that be